r/conspiracy. Popular_application1 says, do you believe 9/11 was staged by the US government? I was watching the Disney Plus series Mr. In Between, where one character says there's only 3 steel buildings that has burned down by fire throughout history, and all of them on 9/11. Now I'm the kind of person that loves an alternative view of something most people consider obvious, like how the pyramids were built, or what glitter manufacturers are hiding from the public. In this case I've always thought about 9/11 and how a lot of details don't add up. For example, how 3 separate airplanes could divert from their course for that long over New York without any interaction from the nation with the greatest air defense on the planet. So with that said, I'd love to hear what interesting things you got on 9/11 that would make you question its broadly viewed cause. Donwap1 says, what gets me is the fact that the plane that ended up hitting the Pentagon was off course for 50-ish minutes. When the FAA notices a large commercial aircraft off of its flight plan, communication is attempted. Once that fails, the Air Force is called to intercept. The average intercept time over the continental US was about 10 minutes. $1 trillion defense industry and an aircraft hits the most protected building in the most protected airspace in the continental US after a 50-minute joyride. How? No adequate explanation will ever be given for this. Don't get me started on the pilot, who, according to his CFI, couldn't handle a Cessna 150 in a crosswind, yet managed to maneuver a 150 pound aircraft through a 320-degree descending turn to perfectly hit the Pentagon in the budget office area. Give me a frick-ing break. Everyone talks about Tower 7, and yeah, that's fishy as well. But this has always been the kicker for me. Data Junkie 1,337,420 says, yet the Pentagon getting hit the way they say it did is just not believable. Isamojo says, then confiscated all videos within miles of the area as well. Hunter Crackhead Pedo says, WTC 7 never forget. Extension Loss 5799 says, did not burn down either. Was not hit by a plane. Just kind of free fell. Thekramer 89 says, if people really believe a building like that is that flimsy, they'd never step inside of a building bigger than 2 stories. Cloche_do_fromage says, paper passports surviving the crash and being found on the pavement was my tipping point. Garrison 72 says, jet fuel can't melt steel passports. Asreal 777 says, hardly damaged and made sure the photos were clearly legible. Mitchman 1973 says, things to remember: 1. The official narrative is a conspiracy theory. One, when challenged, comes up short on proof. For example, ask for proof the 19 alleged hijackers were even at the 3 airports on the day. The absolute best you'll get is a video of 5 adults with no time and date stamp. As for the other 14, they obviously had invisibility technology or could teleport/us. The fact is they can't even show their alleged perps at the places they had to be even be considered suspects. Also remember, these airports were covered in cameras, so where are the time and date stamped security images that should be available by truckload? Nowhere. 2. The NSA report on WTC 1 and 2 does not explain the destruction of the buildings. If you read it, you'll find out NSA admits it found no physical evidence of fires hot enough to weaken the steel, debunking their own hypothesis, and there's even worse than that in there. 3. It was never the public's job to prove the government lied. It has always been the government's job to prove they told the truth, something they have never done. Data Junkie 1,337,420 says, I'm of the opinion that the whole thing is very suspicious for many reasons, especially Building 7. It was never hit by a plane and apparently collapsed due to a fire started by debris from one of the other 2 buildings. It was also reported by the BBC to have collapsed before it actually had. The amount of confusion caused by blips on the radar due to military exercises being conducted on that day is also very suspicious. If it is true that Al-Qaeda terrorists flew planes into the Twin Towers under the instruction of Osama bin Laden, then I still believe the buildings were brought down in a controlled demolition. And that the decision to do so was made by top-level government and military officials instead of letting the buildings collapse in an uncontrolled manner, potentially causing much more damage, destruction, and death. I feel like this is what any government would choose to do in that situation. So either way, I believe that the United States government murdered American citizens on US soil that day. The official account of events is just not believable to me. Popular_application1 says, I get your point, save the masses, but this means the Twin Towers were laced with explosives already in case of such an event. Datajunkie 1,337,420 says, yes, explosives would have had to have been in place prior to the planes hitting, and that does make it very unlikely to have been anything other than a pre-organized terrorist attack by the US government. Eileen Refugee 51 says, at this point, if you still don't believe 9/11 was pre-planned well in advance and purposely executed from the inside and out, then I don't know what to tell ya. There's a mountain of evidence that shows how this was a false flag attack. Honestly, there's so much going on with 9/11 that if you didn't believe it, I wouldn't blame you. It is a super deep rabbit hole that branches out into so many directions. And you won't truly understand just how sinister it was until you explore those paths. Normal Painter 2692 says, the missing original news footage as well, and interviews on Live TV saying there was a detonation when the building fell. Extension Loss 5799 says, I remember seeing one at some time where you can hear a series of detonations similar to when casinos and hotels are demolished. Project Northwoods 2.0. Aware Marketing 9946 says, I watched it and saw that on NBC, and mysteriously the tune changed. Astness says, wait, what are glitter manufacturers hiding from the public? Chowderbag says, it's unknown who the largest consumer of glitter is, and the glitter industry won't say. More than likely it's the US military using glitter as chaff. Inliner 4 Power says, I heard it was for boat paint that gets eroded in the ocean and leaves behind tons of microplastic, and that's why they are so coy. Beef Willington Speedo says, no, it was a bunch of Arabs with box cutters. Gaz 3028 says, and indestructible passports. Datajunkie 1,337,420 says, and Epstein really did kill himself. V2G6 says, bro Larry Silverstein and WTC7. Extension Loss 5799 says, I remember around 2008/09 watching a documentary on Netflix before the evil corporate takeover and censorship. It had a lot of interviews with Army Corps of Engineers that blamed thermite for the towers falling. Thermite uses, if I'm not mistaken, the hottest chemical reaction on Earth known to man. Jet fuel doesn't even burn hot enough to melt the top of steel used according to this document. They showed military-grade thermite rope wrapped around a beam at an angle, and it sliced through it like butter. Their theory was that the four corners were cut at an angle to basically form a spearhead for a free fall. It was very compelling. I'd say this documentary and Food Incorporated were the two that started my journey into conspiracy and distrust for the government. Severe Brush 1241 says, Loose Change is the name of the documentary. Isamojo says, Loose Change is the documentary that changed my life once I knew the government was capable of doing that. There's no stopping to what they'll do. I think more people are realizing it now since COVID. If it wasn't for all the censorship, now you can't find Loose Change anywhere, maybe on Rumble. Prestigio Switter Boys says, the fact that they were running a simulation of the exact same scenario is what has always stood out to me. There should be no way in hell that the attackers would have that information, and yet it provided the perfect cover to the day's actions. There can be no way it was a coincidence. The Apostle says, just like they did with cover 2. Bomber Claude 75 says, Lucky Larry and the 5 dancing, censored. Hot Willingness 8735 says, shut it down. Sergio 127 says, holy shit, there isn't even a 1% chance that it wasn't planned by the US government. I genuinely can't take people who believe it was orchestrated by some terrorist from the Middle East seriously. Cherkov 69 says, the Pentagon is the reason I'm suspicious. And the other 100 reasons. But that damn Pentagon tomfoolery. Vast_Ninja 8299 says, yeah. Pretty obvious it was. Thought most people, even normal people, have figured this out. Beverla Chilbally 96 says, no one ever talks about the Israeli men that were arrested with a truckload of explosives on 9/11 just down the street from the towers. Haran Aljal says, the US government is simply the administrative arm of those who cast no shadow. Understand the depth of the deception. A coup d'etat occurred in 1963 when Kennedy was murdered. The Federal Reserve is not federal, and there is no reserve, it's just a club, and we are not in it, for instance. Bush and Obama are cousins. How do 2 planes, sick, knock down 3 buildings the day after $21 trillion announced as missing? Many of us were born at night. Just not last night. Ego_tripped says, I'll always wonder how the most militarized country the planet will ever see managed to allow this to happen while a couple $1 trillion were being debated. And note how Bush's relative was the absent radar guy during Pearl Harbor. Exploring Through World 797 says, it was so obvious, but our citizens aren't the smartest at seeing truth. Oh, and take your vaccine, it'll help others. International and 4513 says, I'll never ever believe that jet fuel can make 2 1,300 foot buildings collapse when it was struck high up too. And it fell down so orderly. I also will never believe that the other building, 7, cold fallen as a result of what happened to the other 2 when they didn't hit it. Not to mention people heard explosions. Bird Estates says, I was there. We got out of the building and watched the entire thing go down from a block away until we ran for our lives when it fell. If you saw how it burned over the time period we all stood there and watched it, no one would ever have any questions of how a building like that could collapse the way it did. Cameras didn't do it justice. Everything you watched on your TV did zero of what actually happened justice. You had to see it. See it get so molten and slag like that. I couldn't begin to describe it. Aquaponics says, gelatin and the B thing or B team or E team. Look them up and figure out what they were doing with BB-18, boxes and boxes of them, in the towers with unrestricted access prior to the event. That is a pretty big and underexplored space. Krillik says, don't forget the day prior, Rumsfeld admitted over $1 trillion was unaccounted for. Richard 26 says, obviously. Copernicus says, fun fact. I worked in a building in Minneapolis called Butler Square. It is very old and a timber-framed, multi-story building. This had a steel structure added at some point, then there was the fire. The was so hot it melted the steel structure, and it had to be demolished, while the original wood-framed portion was cleaned, and remains in service today. Swordfish says, watch Everything's a Rich Man's Trick JFK to 9/11. It breaks down all the data. Ernest Borgnine Sax says, 100%. Cheap Web 6730 says, I'm amazed that anyone who has looked into 9/11 doesn't think it was staged. Hasman says, yes, and I think the conversation about those towers is purposefully distracting. I don't believe we were told the truth about 9/11. Happy to explain why, and it has nothing to do with the plethora of bullshit theories about melting towers or whatever. The one thing that sticks out to me more than anything off the top of my head, General Mahmoud and of the Pakistani IC. The IC are the Pakistani equivalent of our CIA. About a year or so before the attacks on 9/11, I believe General Mahmoud had arranged that $100,000 be transferred into the hands of the lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta. On the morning of 9/11, Mahmoud was having breakfast with Portagos, then one of the higher members of the House Intelligence Committee. Now, in terms of intelligence, the House Intelligence Committee will know everything, even more than the president. If aliens landed, they know about it. At this time, despite the common argument that we receive a lot of signal noise that could have had this information buried, we were receiving a mountain of indications that an attack against the United States by Al-Qaeda was coming from a multitude of sources. But, benefit of the doubt. Maybe they missed it. In either case, Portagos was sitting next to and having a conversation with one of the architects for 9/11 on the morning of the attacks. The commission knew about this transaction, and when it was brought up during their hearings, they basically said it didn't matter, it wasn't important. Someone within the US government and or intelligence apparatus thought it was important enough to pressure the Pakistanis to push Mahmoud out of his position as head of the IC as punishment though, and he vanished into obscurity, becoming an Islamic cleric. Then there is NAC, the Project for a New American Century. NAC was a think tank chaired by prominent neoconservatives like Bill Kristol, with endorsements from members of the Bush administration. NAC published a paper 1 year before 9/11 on September 2000 called Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. You can find a PDF if you Google it. In short, this report was a warning that, unless the United States could increase funding for the military, it would find itself falling behind global competitors like Russia, and that unless there was some catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor, their exact wording, PG-51. I believe, been a while since I looked at it, us citizens would be unwilling to support such increases to the defense budget. George F. Kennan, prominent US diplomat and father of containment theory, said in the 1980s, were the Soviet Union to sink tomorrow under the waters of the ocean, the American military-industrial establishment would have to go on, substantially unchanged, until some other adversary could be invented. Anything else would be an unacceptable shock to the American economy. Noam Chomsky, opinions aside, said that our military is misunderstood. That there is a surface level perception of how military industry operates, but that it is far more damning and far more impressive in its scope regarding how our economy relies on the military industry. In essence, procurement establishes a roadmap for our high-tech economy 10, 20, 30 years in advance. We find ourselves in a conflict and our government puts out a request for a new laser-guided bomb. Several companies compete to design this new bomb with a set number of requirements. In order to achieve this goal, these companies must develop and produce new technologies that didn't exist before. A winning company is selected, the bomb is procured, and the surface level of this transaction is apparent. We buy the bombs, they are manufactured, and these companies make huge profits and states maintain jobs manufacturing these weapons. But the underlying, larger picture goes unnoticed. These technologies that were developed are adopted by corporations like Microsoft, Apple, GE, etc. They are used to produce a new generation of consumer products with thousands of new jobs being produced in the commercial sector. For every procurement order, there is an iceberg of macroeconomics taking place below the surface. Here is what I believe. The Soviet Union collapsed just 10 years before this report was written. America needed an enemy to justify an increase in military spending, not just for the relatively low contribution to the GDP that direct arms sales and weapons manufacture provides, but for the underlying spine of economic development that procurement provides, and without a large threat like the Soviet Union, like the report said, we would never accept an increase in military spending. Not without something to truly terrify us into complying. Not without our own Pearl Harbor event. And we got one. A big dramatic spectacular event that the entire world was watching in gross detail. And that administration absolutely launched at that crisis with gusto. They say never let a good crisis go to waste, but this was different. I believe this was a manufactured crisis. They established a new amorphous enemy that could provide everything they needed for over 20 years. Young people born and raised inside the war on terror won't have a basis with which to judge the before and after. But the world just after 9/11 was, fricking bonkers. It wasn't just that the public was spontaneously engaging in unfounded, irrational paranoia and fear. It was that administration and the mainstream news media, almost unanimously, were in lockstep, stoking this fear and paranoia. Not an ounce of reason or self-reflection or consideration was encouraged, explored or even entertained. The very worst timeline. Everything we could do wrong, we did. Everything thought, every policy, every action was as bad as it possibly could be. Then you wrap your tinfoil hat on extra tight, and you read things like Operation Copper Green, where Rumsfeld himself endorsed and encouraged what happened in places like Abu Ghraib, and on the surface you might think this was a terrible mistake. Funny how many mistakes we made and nobody got fired or rebuked, but I consider it an attempt to kick the hornet's nest. To stoke fear and hatred among the populations in this occupied territories. Everything we did seemed designed to make things worse. Debathification, policies which encouraged sectarianism, torture, assassination, surveillance. All of it was a complete and total nightmare. Robin Cook of the British Labour Party at the time said that Al-Qaeda didn't exist before Iraq, at least nowhere near the scale we were led to believe at the time, a multinational secretive network of elite Spectre-like agents that had infiltrated across the Western world. But after our occupation, after all of our mistakes, suddenly Al-Qaeda and organizations like it found themselves with a groundswell of recruits all hoping to fight against the Great Satan. After the Soviet Union fell, Al-Qaeda erupts onto the scene. 5 or so years later, Bush brazenly tells the world Al-Qaeda doesn't matter anymore. Then ISIS emerges from a situation we created and knew would happen when we left Iraq in the manner we did. Now that ISIS has been defeated, and now that we have left Afghanistan, and as the war on terror slowly broils across many different nations in that part of the world, we find ourselves readjusting yet again. Gearing ourselves up for an opponent that can truly replace the Soviet Union, and not just act as a mere stand-in. Now strap that tinfoil hat on extra tight. Us planners tasked with concern regarding continuity of government have for the longest time acknowledged that the largest threat to the United States government has, and most likely always will be, the American people themselves, and we have just spent the last 20 years engaged in a war against an insurgency that has provided us a litany of strategies, policies, and technology specifically designed to combat this scenario. And we are already starting to see a shift in rhetoric towards domestic homegrown terrorism. It goes without saying that there is already a track record clearly indicated with things like Operation Northwoods. This was a plan signed off on by the Joint Chiefs, only getting the kibosh. Different_visit_2756 says. Hold on, back up, glitter manufacturers? Tell me more. Greeny Antern says. Operation Northwoods is all the proof anyone should need that the United States government did it. Idlichet says. At this point, 20 plus years later, I'm still on the side of let it happen. But certainly no jet crashed into the side of the Pentagon. The reported speed of the plane near ground level was physically and structurally impossible. More like a cruise missile. T1 Foil 40 says. It's so obvious. ID9 and T want to sound like an ass, but it blows my mind how anyone can watch the collapses and not see it's a controlled demolition. It's brutally obvious. Rayobs 280 says. Anyone who believes 9/11 was not a false flag is just very naive / stupid / ignorant, or deep down they know it was, but do not want to admit it for all the implications that come with it when you realize. Desert Ouch says, my take on conspiracies has vastly changed since COVID. I never dismiss anything, no matter how outrageous it sounds. Fawn to Social 420 says, the two biggest flaws that had me questioning the narrative on day one. 1. The passenger jet that hit the Pentagon left zero damage from the wings or the giant engines mounted on the wings. The only footage from one of the most heavily surveilled buildings on the planet is from a low-quality gas station camera, and the passenger jet looks an awful lot like a missile. 2. The Secret Service informed the president that they have an unknown number of terrorists in hijacked planes headed towards targets, and they let him stay and continue reading. At a public event, with terrorists potentially on the way. If it was a real terrorist attack, they would have ushered him out of there so fast, but they knew he wasn't a target. There's also the $3 trillion that told Rumsfeld said was missing like 3 days before, and unless I'm mistaken the room in the Pentagon that was hit just happened to be the room where they were investigating what happened to that $3 trillion. Things that make you go. No problem Cupcakes says, I'm sorry but yes I believe that. Irestla de Tyranitus says, it's very difficult to look at the evidence and, at least, not come to the conclusion that the US government had foreknowledge of these attacks and simply let it happen, which would be just as sinister as directly assisting in its execution. If you look at the second and third order effects of 9/11 over the following 20 years, the federal government got everything it wanted and more out of this event. The highest levels of patriotism since I pretends to pillage the Middle East and endless blank checks for contractors and investors. Not to mention anyone questioning this event is considered a lunatic and the facts surrounding it have been lost to time and memory hold by now in the year 2023. 9/11 didn't just succeed, it overperformed. BB1 says, 9/10 was a real conspiracy, where the Pentagon announced that it couldn't account for trillions of dollars. Hawk Beardo says, not exactly the US govt, but a faction within the US govt. Darthmkshititits says, not the whole government, but a small faction that isn't elected. Probably the same department that no longer needed to explain the missing money. Womantree1 says, currently, America's fiat currency gains its stability from the dissemination of the dollar into world markets via its exclusivity with opaque trading procedures. Usama bin Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden's overall plan was to create a scenario in America where the FBI would arrest and question his mole operatives who were associated with the House of Sword. This would have caused a backlash that would have resulted in the Swordists not only dumping us debt, but also restructuring their exchange model to be more inclusive to the euro, which was what Saddam's real crime was, while in violation of the US embargo. It was not weapons of mass destruction as much as it was encouraging the use of the euro in a market dominated out of necessity by the fiat currency of the US Federal Reserve System. To head off this inevitability, family members were whisked out of the United States before federal investigators could file the necessary legal paperwork with the Department of Justice. No detainments, incarcerations, or trials. Put a prompt end to at least a continuance of the most obvious economic consequences of the initial attack. Fast forward to today. Currently, the US dollar is made of cotton fiber. Although we say that the money is printed, technically it is actually dyed into the surface threads much like a very starchy colored t-shirt. That is why the ink doesn't run when you leave a few dollar bills in your swim trunks and go for a dip. Currently, enthusiasts of bin Laden's unique form of economic warfare have already begun experimenting on the retainment structure of the fibers of these bills. These enthusiasts are not limited to Islamic nations, but include powers such as North Korea. The experiments upon these bills include varied poisons, hallucinogens, and contagions, the effects of which are intended to cause a disruption in hand-to-hand trade of these bills and with it, a loss of confidence in the US dollar as a method of exchange. The severity of the contagion will determine the strength of the economic backlash. As with 9 to 11, incompetency will be to blame for the failures on the part of State Department officials to foresee or to stop this from happening. With global economic collapse rearing its head again in large part due to an irresponsible derivatives market, attack of this nature upon the US dollar will not go unaddressed. In an attempt to stabilize the market, world leaders will fall over themselves to salvage the current hierarchic system of monetary exchange by extolling the virtues of a cashless society. In an attempt to rein in these unforeseen actions by hostile belligerents from without, as well as from cells within the migrant populations within, greater civil control will be encouraged in the form of convenience technologies. The feminized male population of Europe will rhapsodize over how a brand name technology saved them from all the bad men. And all it took was a mildly painful penetration of their skin. Anti-establishment and anti-Christian element in the Americas will press their own authorities to follow suit. Resist being chipped at. Tommy_Wimmy_guy says, I've always been of the opinion that the government didn't stage the attacks, they just let them happen cause they knew they would benefit from them. Brashiofit says, it's all very suspicious. But everyone also tells me how inept and stupid the government is. I'm torn. Yomam Shabi says, they let it happen. CIA obstructed the FBI and damn near held the terrorists' hands. Clean_old says, it's amazing to me that two 110-story buildings, built with thick, steel I-beams to withstand airplane collisions, were able to burn to the ground in under 10 seconds each. Nothing in physics class prepared me to understand that. Swaguhai33 says, Building 7 dropping, but was never hit. Plus controlled demolition on all 3, easy to spot. DEvil_Thompson says, 100%. The physics don't support the official narrative. Textbook controlled demolition. Res125 says, it's all sketchy. 1. The missile-shaped hole at the Pentagon, and no plane remnants found. 2. The other plane that supposedly crashed in a field. 3. Building 7 controlled demolition in the afternoon. 4. Passports being found of terrorists. Please. Mammoth_Island_2792 says, I just got, and lost in this thread for 2 full hours. Hugatro says, I don't know what the truth is. But minimum they knew it would happen, and let it happen. The official story makes no sense. Too many coincidences, the amount of one-offs, and breaking the laws of nature. Example, paper surviving, but steel beams melt. Everything about 9/11 is off. I think people knew on the day something wasn't right. And even those who defend the official story know it's bunkum. It's why they get so violent when you question it. As E22 says, I love this subreddit, everyone gets what I'm putting down. 911 was obviously a ing inside job. It collapsed bottom, first plane hit 86th floor, second tower was around the same I believe. WTC-7 had all the evidence of the setup, so it had to go too. And the Pentagon strike left no plane body at all, just a few random parts. Also, the plane supposedly knocked over a ton of light poles with its wings. The wings store the fuel. It rolled, went kablooey, and the only evidence people have to debunk my theory is why. They wanted a war with Afghanistan and Iraq for its oil and heroin products, poppy fields, to help their collapsing economy. So stupid. Bush is criminal. MR_Samurai3 says, I used to work at a steel plant that had at times somewhere roughly in the neighborhood of 1 million tons of steel slabs stored outdoors. All between 8 inches to 10 inch thick. Way thicker than any WTC steel. It took up 20 times more acreage than the debris pile of WTC. They had more material than that, and somehow it all fit down into an acre. The buildings turned to dust. It's impossible. They were destroyed by advanced weaponry. Mundana Drawer says, I think they found out about it early enough that they had time to find a way to maximize the event to suit their own ends. Supreme_Cortex says, if you want more info on it, the documentary September 11th, The New Pearl Harbor is probably the best you'll find, and in my opinion the best conspiracy documentary ever made. It's long, almost 5 hours, but it's stuffed with interesting information and well-formed questions/arguments. The only point I disagree with it on is that they say a missile hit the Pentagon. I'm of the opinion that it was a smaller plane or drone of some kind. Background Box 8030 says, trillions of dollars worth of gold was taken out of America that day while all aircraft were grounded. The next $1 trillion event is just around the corner, and who knows what or how big the cover-up event is gonna be. OK_C_6214 says, in the Netflix show Inside Job they discuss every conspiracy theory possible, except vaccines, covered in I believe 9/11. Season 2 came out in 2022. Bleediness says, it's staring you right in the face, the plane that hit the South Tower. 50 miles of visibility that day. So why does the pilot wait until the last moment to turn the plane into the tower, when he could have easily lined up visually, while still 50 miles out? Best explanation, pilot wasn't in control. A microwave landing system was installed in advance in one of the offices in the tower. MLS can be small, so this is doable. The plane's avionics were rigged to follow a predetermined course that terminated with that MLS. Conceivably, a single person with the right access could have achieved 9/11 all on his own. Nanila Venfathat says, this post and the comments are giving me old Primar/conspiracy vibes that I sorely missed. Drodroid says, believe. No is more like it. N0Stress says, watch the original Loose Change. Hiriga Grilling again says, I remember GWB pushing them to clean up the debris, to use the steel to build a ship, or something, by the end of the year. This was a huge crime scene that should have taken a year or two to properly go through, but it was all cleaned up in 3.5 months. I remember thinking that was highly suspicious. Looking back, with all the conspiracy theories, it's even more suspicious now. Vault 247 says, yes 100%. Electric Sister says, what are glitter manufacturers hiding? Never heard this. Iconoclast63 says, here's what I believe, the official story is a lie and has more holes than a spaghetti strainer. That said, I don't know what did happen. I just know they lied. Almostover1 says, what? Is this a test to see if this post will remain here? There's an entire quarantine sub in 9/11 with the best information that exists. Pete 728,415 says, it wasn't prevented, I'll say that. The_lady_bird says, who doesn't? K_LLY_herself says, it was allowed to happen. Shitbag22 says, this shit is run by fake Christians, fake politicians. Look at their mansions, then look at the conditions we live in. All they talk about is terrorism on television. They tell you to listen, but they don't really tell you the mission. They funded Al-Qaeda, and now they blame the Muslim religion. Even though Bin Laden was a CIA tactician. They gave him billions of dollars, and they funded his purpose 9/11, that's just scratching the surfaces. Shinkalki says, yeah, not sure how true that painting is of Bush throwing a paper plane at 2 towers of Jenga blocks and toppled them down. Apparently it was in Epstein's house. Not sure if it's just being passed around as fake or true, but if true that's very telling. Something was definitely off about that event. Without a doubt. Alarmed_cockroach 914 says, the fact that the plane that hit the Pentagon hit the side of the building and not the top of it made no sense. How is a pilot going to bring that plane down at the speed that thing was going and was able to fly it into the side of that building has always came off as unbelievable to me. Klimbin_trees says, I saw a video a few years back and cannot find it anymore that was called 20 Reasons 9/11 was caused by lasers, and it really made sense. And now that Hawaii burned and seeing those burned cars that look very similar makes me believe it more. Ford_tough_82 says, have you ever considered that the plane that went down in the field was meant for WTC 7 and since it crashed they had to blow building 7 anyways? They made mistakes that caused the population to wake up to what was going on. Weintrusson says, I said it when I was a kid in middle school. If a middle school kid can see through it, then why bother questioning it? Of course it was staged. System 30 to keep says, just went to WTC yesterday, no way they didn't know about those planes. Philip Cape says, government. Like some George from Parks is to blamed. Or you mean rogue agencies? Throwaway 211,998 says, CorbettReport.com/911. This is the best journalist alive. Watch these if you're seeking truth. Start with follow the money. Competitive_bus_919 says, Israel runs the USA. r/conspiracy. WTC_survivor says, I was working at the World Trade Center on 9/11. My office was on the 51st floor of North Tower, which was the first hit. On the morning of 9/11 I stepped out of the subway around 8:45 am into the WTC concourse. The concourse was a subterranean passageway full of shops and restaurants and normally is full of bustling commuters, but strangely it was full of smoke and empty. At the time I thought there was some kind of construction going on. When I heard someone scream get out, I went outside to a scene of chaos. Everyone was on the street, debris was flying everywhere, and people were gawking at the fiery tower with people jumping. After some time, I heard a second explosion, the second plane. There was mass panic and people scattered in every direction. I walked home to the East Village to safety and followed the events from the radio, 1010 winds, because I did not have a TV. Land/cell phones were not working. I had internet access and was able to tell a few people that I was okay. Many of my colleagues were actually in the office or by the elevators and everyone shared their version of the events to each other when we got together again. So even if I wasn't on the 51st floor at the time, I'm aware of what many of my office mates had gone through and will try to answer questions about that perspective. Some of my close friends are aware that I had been through this, but it's an experience I tend not to share openly. It is a killjoy light friendly company, and also it's a sensitive topic because I have a lot of lingering emotions from this experience. I had worked in that building for many years and even went pretty regularly to Windows on the World, the bar/restaurant on the top floor. Edit elaborated more on walking home from the WTC and the way I feel about it. Edit to I'm going to bed. It's 1 o'clock Est, GMT-5, and I have to work tomorrow. I have my email ready to send to moderator to get me a star. I will answer more questions. Fasmith_4 says, are you going to answer any questions? Miyike says, I haven't seen a reply yet after an hour, the government probably killed him already. Eat Me Liver Please says, this thread is closed folks, nothing to see here. The Thread Commission will provide further details in a few years. Obsessed with them says, do you have a sense of survivor guilt, as if you were meant to be killed that day, but were lucky enough to survive? WTC_survivor says, no guilt, just a huge sense of luck. I was minutes from being killed in the elevator. Many of the people who took the elevators when the plane hit were killed instantly when they slammed to the ground. Briguid says, I'm not sure this is true. I could be terribly wrong, but don't most elevators have emergency brakes so that if the cable breaks, they don't just fall and instead just stop? Think Tank 58 says, fellow Ground Zero survivor here. Glad that you made it out safely. WTC_survivor says, high five. Loudog1104 says, exactly a month before September 11th, my mother, my sister and I were visiting the World Trade Center. At the top floor, across from the cafe they had these big windows that you could walk up to and look out over the city. My sister was very afraid to go near them, and my mother said something along the lines of don't worry, those windows aren't going anywhere. Rep Omen says, your mom is the anti-Nostradamus. WTC_survivor says, you must be talking about windows on the world/greatest bar on earth. That was a wonderful place. Birdelane says, did all your colleagues survive? Do you still work for the same company? WTC_survivor says, luckily everyone survived. We were only 80 and occupied a relatively low floor, 51st, and everyone was able to walk down the stairs. Deleted says, 51st and everyone was able to haul us down the stairs. Fi. Deleted says, what emotions do you go through when you hear conspiracy theories concerning 9/11? WTC_survivor says, I have nothing against conspiracy people. I think people believe in conspiracy for reasons that are probably more emotional than factual. Conspiracy, like sensationalist journalism, is simple, exciting, and easy to consume. Life and facts are sometimes boring, details are complex, and these things just get in the way of a good story. Papillon24 says, this is one of the most well written and well thought out things I have ever read about conspiracy theorists. It summarizes beautifully exactly how I feel about them. Would you mind if I quote you? Deleted says, are you scared of planes? Tall buildings? WTC_survivor says, no. This incident did not instill any new fear into me. Deleted says, did this experience change the way you view people from the Middle East? WTC_survivor says, not really. I was never one to generalize the behavior of a few extremists to swaths of people. What it made me feel was that there was a general level of anger amongst some of these people that foamed into extremist individuals. Brown Sound 00 says, good on ya man. The Federal Reserve says, you working there? You had a job within an inside job. Thewasamishia says, PFFT, look who's talking. That little Yankee says, do you still work in New York? WTC_survivor says, yes, I've been living and working here since 1997. Huaman says, what was the worst memory you have from all of this? Can you detail what you saw and heard? Do you have any details about a co-worker working on the floor that made it out? Did they get descriptive of what they saw and the events from within the building? WTC_survivor says, the worst had to be watching people jump out from the building. I did not hear the thuds because I was on Fulton and Church Street, but many of my colleagues who were a bit closer heard the thuds of bodies hitting the ground. To watch a person so desperate to escape the pain of fire that he is willing to commit suicide is terrible in two ways. 1. The fire must have been extremely painful, and 2. The will to live, one of the strongest human emotions, had fled their souls. I think it was this idea that made me sick to the stomach. I was with a colleague, and she was bawling hysterically, unable to pry herself from the sight of people hurling themselves off of the tower. Deleted says, the thing that freaks me out the most is imagining the fall. First the clamor and the roar of the fire, the smoke and the screams. A moment of adrenaline, the stomach dropping from the body, then the chill and the roar of the air, and the city tumbling methodically after the sky. Lunacy. Catherine says, sorry, I'm not trying to be a dick or anything. Is there a way a mod can verify this? I'm very interested in the questions, but would like to have some surety. WTC_survivor says, I might be able to find my old WTC pass. Either that or I can produce proof that I was employed at the company on the 51st floor. I also get regular mailings from the WTC health registry. If you guys insist, I can definitely provide evidence. Not sure how to contact the mods about this. Edit, I found my old ID card. It verifies my employment at the company I worked at, which you can easily verify was at the North Tower of the WTC. I can email a picture of the card to a moderator, but I don't know to which email I can send this to. Funny enough, I never noticed that the card had watermarks of 2 towers on them before. Edit, I messaged the moderators but no one has gotten back to me yet. Edit, mods have gotten back to me. Other than Catherine, there's not much skepticism, so unless there's a real uproar for proof, they said we don't need to verify this. As Nagliva says, were you late arriving to work? WTC_survivor says, yes, most people were in by 8:30 am. I had gone out the night before, so I had slept in a bit, so because of that I was not on the floor of my office. This is my excuse to come in 15 to 30 minutes late. Deleted says, Seth MacFarlane, creator of Family Guy, has a famous story about partying too hard on September 10th and missing his flight, the one that would have killed you. Partying saved both your lives. Shootishit says, did you continue to do the work you've always done, or did this cause you to relook at things and possibly head life in another direction? WTC_survivor says, this is a good question. I didn't change anything about my life. However, I know of at least one person at my company who decided to pack it all up and leave back for the West Coast, I think Oregon. I mean, that's a pretty extreme reaction. I know of another person who was born and raised in New York who moved to New Jersey and vowed never to come back to New York again. Deleted says, how close was your floor to where the plane struck? What did your coworker say it was like when it hit? Edit, anyone care to explain why they downvoted me? He specifically said we should ask this question in his text. Many of my colleagues were actually in the office or by the elevators, and everyone shared their version of the events to each other when we got together again. So even if I wasn't on the 51st floor at the time, I'm aware of what many of my office mates had gone through and will try to answer questions about that perspective. WTC_survivor says, I wish I could have done this AMA together with my ex-colleagues. I heard some really interesting stories. We had the entire floor, so everyone had an angle on the situation. A few colleagues were on the north side of the building and noticed the plane. The most common thing they say is that the plane was really low. I had another colleague, actually my boss, who was on the side of the building that swayed to the point where he had the impression that the building was going to topple over. This made a lot of sense. The buildings were built to allow swaying for the wind. I used to hang out at windows on the world almost every Wednesday evening and listen to the creaking noises of swaying. My Colombian colleague was the one who witnessed the elevators crashing. He said he had gone downstairs for a coffee in Bajal when, right before he entered the elevator lobby, the entire lobby turned to smoke with zero visibility. I have another colleague who was on the toilet at the time. He had to hold on to the toilet because the building was swaying so much from the impact. Footballer05 says, what did most people think the explosion was at first? I imagine there was a bunch of different theories. Did everyone just leave immediately? Did the fire alarm go off immediately? Was going down the stairs absolute chaos? WTC_survivor says. I was in the subway during the first explosion, so I don't know how people reacted, but I imagine it was the same as the second explosion that I heard. People had no clue what was going on. We knew the first building was on fire, but no one had any idea why. When the second explosion happened, I could only guess that it was a bomb and they were targeting buildings. When I walked home, I purposefully avoided walking close to tall buildings for fear of bombs and subsequent debris falling. Theosamishia says. For some reason that bit about you avoiding tall buildings because you were afraid of further explosions/debris really freaked me out. Not to be blithe, but that must have been surreal as hell. It's almost theatrical. How intense was your fear there were more attacks coming to New York? Were you paranoid for a while? Vert Blue says. I went to several funerals in the following weeks and months as remains were identified. I lived on Long Island. A few of my friends' parents died that day, be it workers or firemen. I feel your pain, but can't comprehend your experience. I wouldn't have the courage to do what you have done. I congratulate you in your endeavor to educate and illuminate. A Stark says. Other than what happened on 9/11, did you like working there? WTC_survivor says. The World Trade Center held many wonderful memories for me. I remember as a child going there lying on the ground to look up. Tourists did that all the time. I had worked for 2 different companies and had a chance to work in both South Tower and North Tower. Every Wednesday there was a live swing band that played at the very top bar/restaurant, windows on the world, and there was rarely a Wednesday that my friends and I missed to go, hang out, dance, and occasionally buy the $12 substandard cocktails they sold there. At lunchtime my colleagues and I would grab lunch and sit down at some of the chairs by the fountain outside and listen to music in the summers when they brought live music there. I remember listening to the Bengals, Walk Like an Egyptian, playing there during lunch. I was really proud to have worked inside a world-renowned monument. So yes, I liked working there. Bunjix says. What is your strongest memory from that day? WTC_survivor says. That's tough because everything is so vivid. I remember those few hours as if I had recorded it with a video camera and can play it back over and over. I think the strongest memory was just seeing the plumes of smoke and red flames surging from such a high level. I remember thinking to myself how difficult it would be to put it out. Were they going to use helicopters to spray it down? No ladder could be that high to reach that area. Millioneed says. Did you lose anyone you knew well? Direct Rock 42 says. Do you support the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? WTC_survivor says. No, I was vehemently against them, and I don't know if you remember it at the time, but the gut reaction of most people was let's get those fricks. So many of my friends, liberal, moderate, and conservative, thought I was a nut for being anti-war. However, they knew I had been in the WTC, so they gave me some leeway about my anti-war attitude. I love the fact that many of my feelings were posted on an online forum, and today, instead of looking like some peace zealot, I look right and the Hawks look like fans of Bush. It's only been recently that the tide of feelings toward war turned against the war. It's really funny how people's attitude change with the wind. I was against the war because it didn't feel right to go after an entire nation for something that a few people did. Imagine some Koresh-like crazes go to China and decide to blow up something important. I don't think China would be justified in declaring war against the US. Deleted says. At the point when you had walked out of the concourse before the second explosion, were there any police around, or was it just mass pandemonium? Garlictia says. Has New York and its people changed since 9/11? Have you noticed any changes in the culture of the city? A Placid 1234 says. Where did you all go for work after that, and what changed about your job? Well, Plus a Dynamite says. Thanks WTC_survivor for sharing your memories of that eventful day. Retina Rao says, I was in middle school in Brooklyn when it happened, though I lived in Manhattan. What was the mood like, so close to ground zero? I assume it was mildly indescribably, but were people talking? Was it quiet? Were you one of the several thousand people who were just told to start walking north? What happened after you got outside? Quant Boyce says, WTC survivor, I was also down by the WTC that day. I worked in one of the many banks downtown, and like you, when I came out of the 6th train subway station down by the Battery, I saw smoke filled the sky. I walked north up Broadway and saw the towers on fire. However, I really did not realize the enormity of the problem. Because of the extremely heavy fire department presence, I wrongly attributed that the FD would quickly turn out the blaze. I was horribly wrong. Dead Owl says, I feel sad now. Niwatzel says, I have heard people say they heard 2 distinct explosions when the second plane hit. Were you close enough to hear this, or did you just hear one big explosion? I know it's dark, but can you elaborate on what it was like to see humans just falling 100+ stories and landing on the concrete? It is just mind-boggling to me to think so many people were taking that route of death to escape the heat or whatnot. MCT 137 says, I know you say you walked out of the city to safety, but were you still close to the WTC when the towers fell, or were you far enough away by then? Also, what was the first night like for you? Did you spend it with family, coworkers who couldn't get out of the city, friends? I was in college in FL at the time, and I remember a lot of people going out to bars, but the mood was very somber, and it was almost as if people simply didn't want to be alone. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe.